Welcome to the 7th session in the course on sustainable development. Over the last several weeks, we have devoted a considerable amount of time and attention to the role of technology and technological redesign in helping to shape a more sustainable future. The central focus has been to encourage more efficient, and in the case of McDonough and Braungart, more effective use of energy and materials. The underlying premise of ecological modernization and its constituent areas as promoted by people like Amory Lovins and Joseph Huber, and practitioners working in the field of industrial ecology, is that sustainability is a fairly straightforward technical challenge, one best addressed by industrial engineers and environmental scientists. Progress toward sustainability does not need to entail, from this perspective, new social practices, aside from the adoption of novel technologies, new cultural ideals, or new systems of economic organization and governance. We can simply get more from less by being more inventive with the way in which we develop and deploy our tools. This session challenges these ideas and exposes several of the inconsistencies associated with such strategies. We will also develop further this line of inquiry during the weeks following the midterm. To begin then, and to repeat some of my earlier comments, the central premise of industrial ecology, ecological design, and related approaches is that we can devise a largely technological path toward sustainability that significantly reduces global consumption of materials and energy. Though somewhat pejorative, this orientation to problem solving is often referred to as seeking technological fixes, and this tendency is widespread in contemporary society. We believe, say, that we can resolve the problems of automobile safety by installing better safety devices, without emphasizing safer operation by drivers. We presume that we can cure illness by prescribing drugs, without having to encourage people to eat more nutritional diets or live healthier lifestyles. We could obviously go on at great length in this general direction. Implicit in this technology-led understanding of sustainability is the idea that improvements in efficiency will give us the capacity to confront the challenges of the current century. Let us review for a few moments what some of those challenges are. The first is global population growth, and the fact that 40 years from now the planet will grow from 6.8 billion people today to 9 or 10 billion people by 2050. A second challenge is global climate change and the related issue of energy availability and security. The loss of critical habitat and declining biodiversity. Fresh water scarcity and inequitable access to natural resources. It has become common to express the task before us as pursuing improvements of different factor-fold magnitudes, ranging from factor 4, in the eyes of Ernst von Weizsäcker and Amory and Hunter Lovins, to factor 10, according to the European-based Factor 10 Institute, to as high as factor 20, as set forth by the pioneering environmental scientist Barry Commoner. Given even the lower range of these targets, it is unrealistic to presume that we will be able to technologically engineer a more sustainable future on the basis of efficiency improvements alone. We can highlight two particular inadequacies of efficiency-led modes of sustainability. In the first instance, ecological modernization-inspired strategies are still largely producer-driven. They focus, or they impose responsibility, on manufacturers to devise more sustainable ways to satisfy consumer needs, without giving any consideration to the legitimacy or authenticity of those needs. Implicit in such approaches is the notion that producers will engineer more sustainable win-win practices, and we won't have to consider consumer adaptations that might prove politically divisive or socially contentious. Second, proponents of ecological modernization do not offer much in the way of a strategy for getting from here to there, from where we are today to the era of ecological modernity. In this sense, ecological modernization is politically underdeveloped, and some might even say naive. It fails to account for the divisiveness that will ensue and the need to compensate the inevitable losers. The singular application of technology to what are essentially societal problems has a tendency to generate unanticipated rebound effects. Let me demonstrate the ubiquity and the pervasiveness of the rebound effect phenomenon with a few common examples. During the early days of the Internet, it was common to hear proponents make the enthusiastic case that electronic communication technologies would usher in the era of the paperless office. Our work environments were going to evolve from places that look like this to places that look like this. Of course, for a variety of reasons, it has not worked out as anticipated, and paper consumption has, in fact, declined very little in the United States during the intervening years. We are all familiar with the reasons for this outcome. The Internet has led to substantial increases in the flow of communicated information, and because of a lack of confidence in certain aspects of the underlying technology, we feel a compulsion to print out what are deemed to be important documents. The engineers inevitably respond by saying that, well, this is not their problem. This is a social response to the technology. But this is precisely the problem. The typical engineering mode of thinking is to delimit the bounds of the technology in overly narrow ways, and, in many cases, to exclude people from the design framework. When unexpected problems emerge, the flaw is blamed on the people, not on the technology, or the failure to account for the fact that real users would sometimes act in unanticipated ways. However, who did the engineers think was going to be using the Internet? And is it not a breakdown of responsible engineering practice to disregard the need for foresight in how users were going to interact with their computers? We cannot think only in terms of technological systems. We need to consider that technological systems are embedded in societal systems, and that they mutually co-evolve with one another. Let us take another familiar example. We have over the last 30 years invested billions of dollars in new transportation infrastructure, with the primary aim of reducing traffic congestion under the rubric of predicting future transportation demands and then building the necessary additional capacity to meet them. This strategy of building new roadways has unfortunately not contributed to long-term reductions in automobile congestion. According to data from the Federal Highway Administration, whether one lives in a very large urban area, a large urban area, a medium-sized urban area, or a small urban area, congestion has increased. In other words, the result of our investments has been to generate an outcome that is exactly the opposite of what the transportation engineers said it would be. Rather than reducing travel delays, all of the new infrastructure has actually increased them. This situation, too, is the result of failure to consider how people adapt themselves to new roadway capacity. New homes are built adjoining the new roads attract new users, and so forth. At the end of this 30-year period, we find ourselves, ironically, in worse shape than we were at the outset. A third example comes from the realm of meteorology. We have greater knowledge today of weather forecasting and better technical understanding of storm patterns, yet losses from floods and other extreme events continue to increase. This is because people respond to more accurate forecasts by moving to hazard-prone areas, because they have a sense that better information will provide a margin of protection by enabling them to evacuate from low-lying coastal areas in the event of an emergency. I think that this is a sufficient number of examples for the moment to convince you of the validity of something that you are no doubt already familiar with from your own experience, namely the law of unintended consequences. There is a wealth of folk knowledge on this phenomenon. In a complex system, every action will produce counter-reactions. While we might be able to anticipate some of those reactions, the complexity of the system and our necessarily partial understanding of it inevitably means that there will be outcomes that we did not, and probably could not, foretell at the start. Different fields of practice assign different names to this pervasive situation. While engineers do not always acknowledge it, it is known in the field as the take-back effect, or the efficiency trap. Others use the term revenge theory to describe the same thing. Economists tend to refer to it as the rebound effect, or Jevons paradox. We all, however, know it as the law of unintended consequences. We will pursue this idea a little further using the concept of Jevons paradox. William Stanley Jevons, whose name is attached to the idea, was a 19th century British economist who took a keen interest in the development and diffusion of the steam engine. He wrote up the results of his studies in a book published in 1865 called The Coal Question. Jevons described the paradoxical effect that as the steam engine became more efficient due to technological innovation year after year, the amount of work that an industrialist could derive from each ton of coal burned to operate the machine increased. These incremental efficiency improvements led to a stepwise reduction in the per ton price of coal, and ultimately to an increase in the amount of coal consumed. In summary, then, increasing efficiency led to an increase in aggregate coal consumption. This, as we will see, is the basis for a powerful and very unsettling insight. Like in the case of the steam engine, the energy intensity of the United States, the amount of energy measured in BTUs required to produce a monetized unit of economic output has decreased. This is a common post-industrial phenomenon. As large-scale, energy-extensive industry has been closed down and the national economy has shifted in the direction of service provision, we require less energy to generate each dollar of output. Despite this notable achievement in energy intensity, aggregate energy consumption has increased and is expected to continue to increase into the foreseeable future. Let me demonstrate this phenomenon using a somewhat more tractable example. Before the advent of modern means of household refrigeration, people chilled food using ground storage. With large-scale urbanization, the household preservation of food became reliant on ice boxes of various types. Electrical refrigeration in households then became widespread after World War II. Today, household refrigeration is essentially universal in countries like the United States. Some 98 or 99% of households in the country have refrigerators. Quite a few have more than one. It has even become common to refrigerate foods like cheese and bread that do not need to be kept cool because we have lost our ability to distinguish between different kinds of food. In most homes, the refrigerator is the second most energy-intensive household appliance after air conditioning. There has been, as most of you are probably aware, significant improvement in the efficiency of household refrigerators over the last 30 years. The amount of electricity required to cool each cubic foot of refrigerated space has declined quite substantially due to technical improvements. From an engineering standpoint, this is a notable achievement, though it also speaks to the massive inefficiencies associated with prior generations of household refrigerators. Looked at more systematically, what we have had in household refrigeration is a period of steady increase in energy per cubic foot through the 1970s, the blue line in the figure. Energy consumption was simply not a factor in the design of refrigerators during this time. Massive amounts of new electrical capacity were coming online during the post-World War II period, and household refrigeration came to be regarded as a quintessential need of the then modern home. In due course, washing machines, clothes dryers, dishwashers would become subject to the same dynamic, much like mobile phones over the past few years. Then, in the early 1970s, and still focused on the blue line in the graph, the design parameters changed, and refrigeration engineers, motivated by government regulations and new industry standards, embarked on a path of steadily stepping down the energy requirements of refrigerators. At the same time, as represented by the green line in the figure, there was a steady decline in the cost of a comparable unit over time. In other words, refrigerators simultaneously became more efficient and cheaper. There is an important lesson here, namely that under strict regulations and industry standards, efficiency improvements do not need to impose onerous costs on consumers. But that's not the story I want to tell now. The real lesson of this experience is that consumers and producers use the opportunity created by declining prices and improving efficiencies to trade up the size of a household refrigerator. For a given cost, consumers could now afford to purchase a much larger unit. During the course of this process, the notion of what constituted an appropriately sized refrigerator evolved from a unit of modest dimensions that looked something like this to a contemporary behemoth with double doors and a full-size freezer that looks like this. The figure here is from the UK rather than the US, as I have not been able to find a similarly useful graphic for this country. But if I was able to do so, the same instructive point here would apply. Despite all of the notable improvement that has occurred in enhancing the efficiency of refrigerators, considerably more energy is used today for purposes of household refrigeration than was the case 30 or 40 years ago. The efficiency gains have rebounded. They have been traded in for larger and larger pieces of equipment that in aggregate consume more electricity. Indeed, if we look across the entire household, we see that there have been commendable gains in energy intensity since the 1970s, the downward sloping gray line in this figure. Square foot for square foot. In other words, comparing like-sized and like-equipped electrical appliances, efficiency is approximately twice what it was back then. However, because we rely on a much more extensive array of appliances, and the appliances are bigger and have more functionality, we require more electricity to operate them. Aggregate consumption of electricity across the full span of the household is approximately 60 to 70% greater today than it was 4 decades ago. And projections by the U.S. Department of Energy and other federal agencies suggest that household electricity will grow by another 20% over the next 2 decades. Let me provide one more example. Let us say that in a burst of environmental enthusiasm, you decide to replace your old beater car with a new Prius that is twice as fuel efficient. For the sake of this discussion, let us also assume that instead of getting 20-odd miles per gallon with your old car, you now get close to 50 with your new Prius. You now find yourself in the enviable position that it now costs you half as much money to travel the same distance. In other words, over the course of a week or a month, you could maintain the same travel pattern, yet because of the greater efficiency of your new Prius, you will spend half as much money on gas than was previously the case. While some of the fuel savings offset the cost of the new car, you could have, after all, bought a less expensive car that got gas mileage that was no better than your old beater. You will save money on fuel costs over the long term. The situation, however, does not end there. You will now need to consider the secondary effects of your well-intentioned decision, namely, what to do with your windfall. One option might be to move to a new house. Instead of commuting 20 miles each day, you travel 40 miles because you can now travel twice as far for the same cost. You exchange your savings for a house that is located a longer distance from work. This is essentially analogous to the refrigerator example, but instead of a larger cooling unit, you draw on your automobile energy savings to trade in a small house located relatively close to the city for life in a larger home on the suburban periphery. Moving your household is not, however, the limit of the available options. Another alternative might be to accumulate your gasoline savings over a year and take a trip to Tahiti or some other exotic destination. We would say that your automobile energy savings rebounds in the form of aviation fuel to take a trip that you would not otherwise have been able to afford. The point here is that efficiency is like building a savings account. You save money that you would otherwise have spent on energy. One needs to be careful and extremely environmentally conscientious to avoid squandering the efficiency gains that have been generated by your new fuel-efficient car. What to do then? You could deposit the proceeds of your efficiency savings in the bank for an indefinite period. We'll set aside for the moment the problem of what the bank does with your money while it is in its hands. You could work fewer hours with the aim of earning less money. After all, now that you spend less money on gas, you no longer need as much money to maintain your lifestyle, so presumably could enjoy the benefit of greater leisure. You could, at least in a theoretical or conceptual sense, ask the government to tax your windfall. This move absolves you of the responsibility of having to decide how to make the reallocation yourself. So it started out as a seemingly sensible and unproblematic decision to improve your automotive fuel efficiency. In the end, if you are not scrupulously careful, has the unfortunate likelihood of generating a variety of problematic rebound effects. You would face the same sort of dilemma if you decided to invest in energy conservation or by re-insulating the attic of your house. Focusing sustainability initiatives solely on efficiency may be expedient in the short term. After all, efficiency is regarded as a largely positive pursuit, unless, of course, you are part of the labor force that is rendered obsolete by efficiency gains, or you are the supplier of what has become extraneous materials. However, in the context that we are talking about it here, efficiency improvements are likely to be highly elusive over the longer term because of our failure to recognize the strong potential for rebounds unless we sequester the gains. In fact, there is a certain delusional quality about the whole exercise. An improvement in efficiency often does not directly translate into a reduction in aggregate consumption. This has been the lesson of the series of examples we have talked about here over the last several minutes. It makes us feel like we are doing something, when in all likelihood we are just digging ourselves into a deeper hole. In the quest to find a pragmatic and politically agreeable way to embrace sustainability, singular emphasis on efficiency is unfortunately apt to miss the ultimate target. The cartoons that appear in the following two slides make the same point about the potential of rebound effects and our lack of societal capacity to think in such terms. The first cartoon is quick. The second one will probably require you to pause this narration for a few moments. It seems that we have reached the end point of a tragic dilemma. Have sustainability proponents made a grave mistake by putting all of our eggs in a basket that is shot full with holes? Efforts to strive for efficiency improvement seem to be the extent of what is politically viable and acceptable in many places today. Yet a singular emphasis on efficiency is likely to lead to pernicious outcomes that fly in the face of where it is that we want to go. Is there a way out of this tangle? It is instructive to observe, in such an instance, to take a page out of Albert Einstein's book. Einstein once remarked that if he were about to be killed and had only 1 hour to figure out how to save his life, he would devote the first 55 minutes of that hour to searching for the right question. Once he had that question, Einstein said, finding the correct answer would take only about 5 minutes. Such an observation raises the question of whether we have made an error in approaching the problem of contemporary unsustainability. If this is indeed the case, might there be another way to proceed? So then, what might be the question with which we should be concerned? Because of inadequately rigorous thinking, we have manifest a tendency to confuse efficiency reductions with aggregate consumption. Efficiency is a means. It's a strategy. It's not an end in itself. It is not an objective. Did you ever encounter someone who said that their ultimate purpose in some pursuit was to be more efficient? No, of course not. Efficiency can be a helpful way to get to a certain goal, but it is not a goal in and of itself. The point, then, is just because we may improve efficiency does not necessarily mean that we reduce aggregate consumption, which is our ultimate goal. Failing to properly distinguish between objectives and strategies is what philosophers refer to as the means-end fallacy. In other words, we need to be clear that efficiency may be a noble strategy for getting to a particular objective, but it is not an objective in and of itself. Efficiency may be helpful, perhaps even indispensable, for enabling reductions in aggregate consumption. But we need to be careful not to problematically conflate efficiency gains with reductions in aggregate consumption. As we have seen, it is not uncommon for efficiency improvements to lead to perverse increases rather than reductions in aggregate consumption. This is something that has been known since at least the work of William Stanley Jevons. But we have tended to put this insight aside because of its inconvenient implications. It is instructive to recognize that sustainability is like a coin. There is the efficiency side, and then there is the sufficiency side. The next step in conceptualizing the challenges of sustainability will be to develop pragmatic ways to infuse sufficiency into our strategic thinking. This will be a major challenge, because while the concept of seeking efficiency improvements is an unproblematic element of contemporary business logic, there is, as noted earlier, a long managerial history of firms looking to enhance the efficiency of how they deploy labor, with an equally long history of unfortunate implications for individuals who find themselves on the wrong side of improving efficiency. Sufficiency is more distantly removed. Some might even say contradictory to conventional thinking. It is rare, though not impossible by any means, to find firms that would respond to an opportunity to increase sales by saying that their current rate of turnover or profitability was sufficient, and that they did not need to produce or sell any more of their product or service. Part of the problem here is that we lack a language for talking intelligently about sufficiency and operationalizing it in practice. Sufficiency seems to be a quaint notion that harkens back to an earlier era. Some might even think it a laughable idea, one embraced only by fools and madmen without an understanding of the workings of the real world. Has not, after all, the application of Darwinian thinking to the world of business and to the social realm more generally taught us that if we do not continually strive to become increasingly efficient, we will wither? To focus on the household realm, lifestyles predicated upon thrift, prudence, and frugality strike many people as prim and outmoded. Sufficiency may have made sense in earlier eras when people lived relatively austere lives, but it is silly in light of the abundance that we enjoy today. Sufficiency carries a heavy stigma. Is the aim of life, after all, not to expand incomes and to gain control of ever greater volumes of a presumably limitless supply of resources? At the same time, consideration of sufficiency often devolves quickly into largely unconstructive discussions about self-sufficiency. It is encapsulated in the idea that to be sufficient is to withdraw from society, build a cabin in the remote wilderness, and live on wild game and berries. It is for people who lack the capacity and fortitude to compete. It is useful to reflect on why society has cast sufficiency in such terms, and the political and economic interests that have created and perpetuated this idea. After all, the notion of sufficiency or self-sufficiency is inimical to the role of being a dutiful consumer. There have also been efforts on the part of product promoters to impose their own interpretation on nascent attempts to foster a culture of sufficiency, whereby sufficiency of a certain kind becomes an ironical premise for selling goods. Such a practice is inherent in the popular publications displayed here, and this is just the tip of a vast iceberg. The idea of sufficiency gets turned on its head and repackaged as a marketing theme. This observation gets back to a similar point that I made in the previous session about spurious promoters of ecological design. The challenge that sustainability proponents, as well as society more generally, faces is to create social, political, and cultural spaces that make it possible to have meaningful discussions about how much is enough and how much is too much. If we are to make any progress addressing the challenges of the 21st century that we have outlined at the start of this session, there is a need to build societal platforms that give credence to notions of satiation, too muchness, enoughness, and overabundance. A first step in this process is going to entail some resolve to buying less stuff, and a commitment to this objective will require the diffusion of a much broader critique of contemporary consumer culture. The resulting economic changes brought about by these sensibilities will invariably be quite traumatic. However, once we begin to think clearly through the dimensions of the developing situation, what alternatives do we have? One interesting example of such a social and political critique is the effort being mobilized by an organization based in Vancouver called the Adbusters Media Foundation, led by a Danish renegade from the advertising industry named Kalle Lassen. Lassen is an advocate of what he refers to as cultural jiu-jitsu, or culture jamming, that entails taking well-known iconic images and turning them back on themselves, the way that an expert martial arts specialist turns the strength of his opponent back against the opponent himself. Here are a series of examples of this technique being used in practice. Lawson and his colleagues have taken widely common advertising images and recrafted them in creative ways. Some of the results may be discomforting to some. However, the irony and the power of these images derives from the fact that we have all seen them hundreds of times in their original incarnations, and what prompts attention is the way that they have been repurposed. Here is another set of images that are a bit more provocative, but it is through the shock that they impose on our sensibilities that they derive their effectiveness and expose the fragile foundations on which contemporary consumer culture is built. I have posted to the course website 2 videos featuring Kalle Lassen and the work of the Adbusters Media Foundation that demonstrates how cultural awareness and media literacy are important elements of sustainability thinking. We need to develop a shrewder understanding of the forces that drive our current problems of unsustainability, because the situation calls as much for new societal sensibilities as it does for technological innovation. The first of these video clips is from a CNN interview with Lawson. The interview was triggered by the Adbuster Media Foundation's efforts to get some of its so-called subvertisements, subversive advertisements, aired on network television. The networks have consistently refused to run them, but as a concession, CNN agreed to this interview. The other issue under discussion is Lawson's advocacy of the annual event known as No Shopping Day, that is now commemorated and recognized in several dozen countries each year, generally on the Friday following the American holiday of Thanksgiving. I would like you to pay particular attention when listening to this interview to how the interviewer's derisive tone shapes the discussion when Lawson calls for a curtailment on shopping. The second video clip is a montage of several subvertisements that the Adbusters Media Foundation has produced to promote not only No Shopping Day, but a number of other initiatives, including an annual event known as Car Free Day, various anti-smoking campaigns, and campaigns to undermine the excesses of the fashion industry, as well as to promote a national event known as TV Turnoff Week. Some of these segments are a bit on the racy side, so if you find this sort of material offensive, it would probably be best to bypass it. For anyone with an ongoing interest in culture jamming and the work of the Adbusters Media Foundation, as well as other organizations working in the socio-cultural realm of media literacy and its relationship to sustainability, I highlight for you the following feature-length film that you can try to access on your own if you are so inclined. A trailer for the movie is available at the website indicated on this slide. Finally, a different view on the notion of sufficiency is provided by Barry Schwartz, a professor of psychology at Swarthmore College. Schwartz's contention is that an overabundance of choice causes emotional and cognitive paralysis, and hence there is a business and societal case to be made for sufficiency. There is a video clip that I've posted to the website featuring Schwartz, and a recent news article describing the same perspective. Also, since we have spent a good deal of time during this session talking about the socio-technical dimensions of refrigeration, I thought there might be interest in another recent news article describing how some people, in rather radical terms, are rethinking the whole idea of household refrigeration. My aim here is not to endorse or promote this kind of choice. The idea of living without a refrigerator, as outlined in the news article, is obviously not for everyone, but simply to provide some food for thought on the presumed essentiality of things we take for granted, and to highlight some of the lifestyle experimentation that is taking place these days. Once you have viewed these items and read the various news articles, you will have reached the end of this session.